They tied a man between two boats, forced milk and honey down his throat, and left him alive while insects slowly ate him for days. This wasn't horror fiction. This was Scaphism, the most terrifying execution method ever recorded in human history. And what happened to its victims is far worse than you can imagine. In the darkest corners of ancient history lies a punishment so horrifying that many people today refuse to believe it ever existed. Their method was called Scaphism, an execution technique reportedly used in ancient Persia, designed not simply to kill a person, but to destroy them slowly in the most agonizing way imaginable. Unlike beheadings, hangings, or even crucifixions, Scaphism transformed death into a prolonged nightmare that could last for days or even weeks. The victim was trapped inside two hollowed boats or tree trunks, leaving only the head, hands, and feet exposed. At first glance, it may not have looked especially terrifying. But the true horror came afterward. The condemned person was force-fed enormous amounts of milk and honey until their body could no longer control itself. Their stomach swelled painfully, and violent diarrhea covered their trapped body inside the wooden prison. Then came the insects. Flies swarmed to the filth almost immediately, laying eggs in every exposed wound and opening. Under the scorching sun, the victim became a living breeding ground for maggots, worms, and parasites. Day after day, insects consumed their flesh while the person remained alive, unable to escape, unable to move, and unable to stop the pain. Ancient writers claimed the victim would slowly rot from the inside out as infection spread through the body. The smell alone was said to be unbearable. Some victims reportedly survived for over 2 weeks, begging for death long before it finally arrived. Whether every detail is historically accurate remains debated by scholars, but the sheer existence of these accounts reveals something terrifying about ancient punishments. Humanity has always been capable of unimaginable cruelty. Scaphism was not just an execution. It was psychological torture, biological horror, and public humiliation combined into one nightmare. It forced victims to experience their own decay while fully conscious. Even among the brutal punishments of the ancient world, Scaphism stands apart as something uniquely disturbing. And the most chilling part is that this punishment was supposedly reserved for traitors, meaning it was designed intentionally to send a message of absolute terror to anyone who dared betray the empire. The origins of Scaphism are usually connected to the ancient Persian Empire, one of the most powerful civilizations in human history. While Persia is remembered for its grand architecture, military strength, and influential rulers, historical records also contain descriptions of punishments so brutal they continue to shock historians today. Much of what we know about Scaphism comes from the Greek historian Plutarch, who described the execution in disturbing detail centuries after it allegedly occurred. According to his writings, the punishment was reserved for severe crimes, especially treason. The Persian rulers wanted traitors to suffer publicly and slowly, turning their deaths into terrifying warnings for others. In ancient empires, fear was often considered more powerful than mercy. Kings understood that public executions could maintain control over massive populations spread across huge territories. But Scaphism went far beyond ordinary execution. It was designed to maximize suffering in every possible way. The victim was stripped naked and trapped tightly between two boats placed one on top of the other. Their limbs and head remained exposed so they could continue to breathe and remain alive. Guards then force-fed them milk and honey repeatedly, even when the victim resisted or vomited. The mixture caused severe sickness and diarrhea, ensuring the body became covered in waste. More honey was smeared directly onto the exposed skin, attracting flies, wasps, and countless insects from surrounding areas. Under the burning heat, insects began feeding on the flesh and laying eggs. Maggots hatched and burrowed into wounds, slowly eating the victim alive. Meanwhile, dehydration, starvation, infection, and exposure weakened the body further every hour. Ancient accounts describe victims screaming uncontrollably, driven insane by pain, thirst, and the sensation of insects crawling through their skin. Some reportedly lost the ability to speak after days of suffering, only able to groan weakly while their bodies decayed. What makes Scaphism especially horrifying is the patience involved. Most executions seek a quick result. Scaphism aimed for the opposite. The longer the victim survived, the more successful the punishment was considered. It turned death into a spectacle of decomposition. Even today, the concept feels almost impossible to comprehend because it attacks one of humanity's deepest fears, being trapped helplessly while nature slowly consumes you alive. One of the most infamous stories connected to Scaphism involves a Persian soldier named Mithridates, whose fate became legendary for its unimaginable cruelty. According to ancient sources, Mithridates accidentally killed Cyrus the Younger during battle. Although he initially received praise, the political consequences of admitting responsibility for the prince's death created chaos within the royal court. Eventually, Persian authorities decided to silence him permanently. But instead of granting a swift execution, they allegedly condemned him to Scaphism. Historical descriptions claim Mithridates endured the torture for an astonishing 17 days before finally dying. Whether this exact timeline is accurate or exaggerated by ancient historians remains uncertain, but the story has become one of history's most terrifying examples of prolonged torture. Imagine surviving nearly 3 weeks trapped inside a wooden coffin under the burning sun while insects fed on your body. Guards reportedly continued feeding him milk and honey daily to keep him alive longer. Each feeding ensured his digestive system kept producing waste, attracting more insects and accelerating infection. Over time, open sores formed across his skin. Maggots crawled into his flesh. Fever spread through his body. The victim's own immune system turned against him as disease consumed him from within. Ancient writers described how the smell of decay became overwhelming long before death finally arrived. The psychological torment must have been even worse than the physical suffering. Mithridates would have known death was coming slowly, hour by hour, while remaining completely helpless. There was no escape, no mercy, and no possibility of rescue. The human mind is not built to endure that level of prolonged terror. Modern psychologists understand that helplessness combined with extreme pain can completely shatter mental stability. Victims subjected to prolonged torture often experience hallucinations, panic, dissociation, and madness. In Scaphism, the victim was forced to watch their own body deteriorate in real time. The horror became deeply personal and unavoidable. Even if parts of the story were exaggerated over centuries, the account survived because it captured something profoundly disturbing about human cruelty. Ancient civilizations often used fear as a weapon, and Scaphism may have represented the ultimate form of that strategy. The message was simple: betray the empire, and your death will become a nightmare beyond imagination. Thousands of years later, the story of Mithridates still horrifies people because it reveals how terrifying punishment can become when suffering itself becomes the true goal. What makes Scaphism uniquely terrifying compared to other historical punishments is the way it weaponized nature itself against the victim. Many ancient execution methods relied on direct violence, swords, fire, hanging, or crushing. Scaphism, however, transformed insects, disease, sunlight, starvation, and human waste into instruments of torture. The victim's own body became the source of their destruction. By forcing the condemned person to consume excessive milk and honey, executioners intentionally triggered digestive chaos. Severe diarrhea was not merely a side effect, it was a crucial part of the punishment. Human waste collected inside the cramped wooden enclosure, creating the perfect environment for bacteria and insects to thrive. Flies were especially dangerous because they laid eggs rapidly in moist conditions. Once maggots hatched, they began feeding on rotting tissue, turning the victim into a living corpse. Infection spread quickly through open wounds caused by bites, scratching, and exposure. Ancient medical knowledge was extremely limited, meaning even small infections could become deadly. In Scaphism, infection was guaranteed. The victim's immune system weakened under dehydration, heat exhaustion, and malnutrition, making survival increasingly impossible. Yet death still came slowly. That delay was intentional. The executioners wanted the body to deteriorate visibly over time. Witnesses would see the swelling, discoloration, bleeding sores, and insect infestations growing worse every day. Public punishment in the ancient world was often theatrical, designed to terrify entire communities. Scaphism achieved this through unimaginable horror. Even modern forensic experts believe such conditions would create extreme septic shock, organ failure, and overwhelming pain. Victims likely experienced burning fevers, uncontrollable itching, muscle spasms, delirium, and eventually complete bodily collapse. The trapped position alone would have caused unbearable suffering. Lying immobilized for days creates pressure wounds, muscle damage, and circulation problems. Add insects feeding on living flesh, and the result becomes almost impossible to comprehend. Some historians question whether Scaphism was used frequently or whether Greek writers exaggerated Persian brutality for political reasons. Ancient enemies often portrayed rival empires as savage to justify hatred and war. But regardless of how common the punishment truly was, the existence of these accounts demonstrates humanity's long fascination with fear-based punishment. Scaphism remains unforgettable because it combines every primal terror, insects, decay, helplessness, infection, isolation, and slow death, into one horrifying method unlike anything else in recorded history. Ancient civilizations often believed that punishment should reflect the severity of the crime, and nowhere is that philosophy more horrifyingly visible than in Scaphism. To modern minds, execution is usually viewed as a means of ending a life quickly, even when harsh. But in many ancient societies, punishment served a deeper purpose: humiliation, fear, and domination. Scaphism achieved all three with terrifying efficiency. The victim was not simply killed. They were stripped of dignity, transformed into an object of disgust, and displayed as a warning to others. The process attacked both the body and the mind simultaneously. Being trapped helplessly while insects crawled across your skin would create overwhelming psychological panic long before physical death occurred. Humans naturally fear infestation because it signals disease and decay. Scaphism amplified that fear beyond imagination. Victims could likely feel larvae moving inside infected wounds while remaining fully conscious. Every second became torture. Ancient executioners understood something chilling about human psychology: slow suffering creates stronger fear than instant death. A public beheading ends quickly, but a prolonged execution spreads terror through stories and rumors. People remember agony more vividly than speed. That is why punishments throughout history often became theatrical spectacles. Crowds gathered to watch executions because rulers wanted power displayed openly. Fear maintained order. In the case of Scaphism, the horrifying details alone would discourage rebellion. Imagine hearing that traitors were eaten alive by insects over several weeks. That fear could control populations more effectively than armies. Historians often debate whether ancient accounts exaggerated such punishments for dramatic effect. Greek writers especially portrayed Persia as cruel and barbaric. Yet even if details changed over time, torture itself was undeniably real throughout the ancient world. Human history contains countless examples of rulers using pain to maintain authority. Scaphism survives in historical memory because it represents the extreme edge of that brutality. Unlike many punishments focused on efficiency, this method focused entirely on maximizing terror. The victim became trapped between life and death, unable to escape either. Modern audiences are especially disturbed by Scaphism because it feels almost cinematic in its horror. It resembles something from a nightmare or horror film rather than real history. Yet that uncomfortable reaction forces us to confront an important truth: civilizations capable of creating magnificent art, philosophy, and architecture were also capable of inventing unimaginable cruelty. Human progress has always carried both beauty and darkness side by side. As the days passed during Scaphism, the victim's body would begin transforming into something almost unrecognizable. The early stages of the punishment were already unbearable, but the true horror emerged slowly. Under constant exposure to sunlight, insects, and human waste, the skin began breaking down rapidly. Open sores formed wherever flies gathered most heavily. Sweat mixed with honey and filth, creating a sticky layer that attracted even more insects. Their victim could not scratch properly, could not clean themselves, and could not escape the relentless swarming around their eyes, mouth, wounds, and exposed flesh. Ancient descriptions suggest that maggots eventually burrowed beneath the skin, feeding on dead tissue while the person was still alive. Modern science confirms that severe infestations like this can cause excruciating pain, infection, and tissue destruction. The smell alone would have been overwhelming. Rotting flesh produces powerful odors that attract additional insects and predators, turning the victim into the center of a horrifying ecosystem. Every hour made survival less likely, yet death still refused to arrive quickly. Dehydration caused cracked lips, swollen tongues, dizziness, and hallucinations. Fever from infection likely pushed many victims into delirium. They may have seen visions, screamed uncontrollably, or begged guards to kill them. But mercy was never part of Scaphism. The execution's purpose was endurance through suffering. Ancient accounts describe victims slowly losing their sanity as pain and exhaustion consumed them completely. Imagine lying immobilized while feeling your own body decay around you. The human brain struggles to process extreme helplessness. Studies of prolonged torture show that victims often experience total psychological collapse long before death. In Scaphism, the victim's mind became another battlefield. Sleep was nearly impossible because insects constantly crawled across exposed skin. Hunger mixed with nausea from forced feeding. Fear became permanent because the victim knew the agony would continue tomorrow, and the next day, and possibly for weeks. Even breathing would become difficult as infection spread throughout the body. The terrifying genius of Scaphism was its use of time. Most executions are moments. Scaphism was a process. It stretched suffering across days until the victim became trapped in an endless cycle of pain, fear, sickness, and decay. That prolonged destruction is what makes historians and audiences today still consider it one of the most disturbing punishments ever imagined by humanity. The psychological terror of Scaphism may have been even worse than the physical agony. Pain alone is horrifying, but prolonged helplessness changes the human mind in terrifying ways. Victims trapped inside the wooden enclosure would have known there was no escape. Every sunrise meant another day of suffering. Every sound of buzzing flies meant more insects gathering to feed on their wounds. The inability to move freely would intensify panic dramatically. Humans are biologically wired to react violently when insects crawl across the skin, especially near the eyes, nose, and mouth. In Scaphism, victims could do almost nothing to stop it. Over time, the brain itself begins breaking down under constant stress. Modern psychology shows that severe isolation and torture can create hallucinations, paranoia, emotional collapse, and complete mental disintegration. Victims often lose their sense of time and reality. Ancient observers described prisoners screaming, crying, and eventually becoming almost unresponsive as days passed. Some may have entered states of delirium where they could no longer distinguish nightmares from reality. Fever from infection would only worsen these effects. Imagine being unable to sleep because insects continuously bite your flesh while the sun burns your exposed skin during the day and cold air chills you at night. The body would ache constantly from immobility. Muscles would cramp. Pressure sores would deepen. Hunger and dehydration would twist the mind further into despair. At some point, death itself would probably feel like mercy. That may have been the true goal of Scaphism, not merely to kill, but to completely destroy hope. Ancient rulers understood the power of psychological fear. Stories of victims begging for death while remaining alive for weeks would spread rapidly among soldiers and civilians alike. Terror becomes more powerful when people imagine themselves suffering the same fate. That is why extreme punishments often survive in historical memory long after empires disappear. They leave emotional scars on human imagination. Scaphism continues horrifying modern audiences because it attacks universal fears, being trapped, consumed, humiliated, and forgotten while still alive. Unlike quick executions, this punishment forced victims to witness their own decline in real time. They became prisoners inside decaying bodies. Even if ancient historians exaggerated certain details, the psychological concepts behind the punishment remain deeply disturbing. It reveals how human beings discovered long ago that the mind can suffer just as horribly as the body, sometimes even more. Historians continue debating whether Scaphism truly occurred exactly as ancient texts describe, or whether parts of the story were exaggerated over centuries. Much of the information comes from Greek writers, especially Plutarch, who documented Persian punishments long after many events supposedly happened. This creates an important question. Did Greek historians intentionally portray Persia as monstrously cruel to make their enemies appear barbaric? Ancient propaganda was common in warfare and politics. Civilizations often exaggerated the brutality of rival empires to justify hatred, fear, and military conflict. Some scholars believe Scaphism may have been amplified into legend over time, becoming more horrifying with every retelling. Yet even skeptical historians admit the story could contain truth. The ancient world was filled with punishments that modern people would consider unimaginably savage. Crucifixion, impalement, burning alive, and dismemberment were all historically real. Compared to these, Scaphism no longer seems impossible. Persian rulers were known for harsh penalties against traitors because maintaining loyalty across such a massive empire required fear and discipline. Whether every detail happened exactly as described matters less than what the story represents about ancient justice systems. In many empires, punishment was intentionally theatrical. Executions were public performances designed to project absolute power. Scaphism perfectly fits that purpose because it created maximum terror through prolonged suffering. Ancient audiences hearing about insects eating a living person alive would never forget the image. The story itself became a weapon. Historians also point out that the Greeks deeply feared and admired Persia at the same time. Exaggerating Persian cruelty helped reinforce the idea that Greece represented civilization against barbarism. This pattern appears throughout history whenever rival cultures describe one another. Still, certain biological aspects of Scaphism are scientifically believable. Exposure to waste, insects, heat, dehydration, and infection absolutely could create the horrifying symptoms described in ancient accounts. Maggot infestations in living tissue are medically documented even today under extreme conditions. Severe sepsis can slowly destroy the body over many painful days. So while details may have been dramatized, the overall mechanism remains terrifyingly possible. Perhaps that uncertainty is part of why Scaphism continues fascinating people today. It exists in the shadowy space between documented history and nightmare legend. But whether entirely factual or partially exaggerated, the story survives because it touches something primal within human imagination, the fear of slow helpless destruction at the hands of both nature and human cruelty. Scaphism also reveals a darker truth about human civilization: cruelty often evolves alongside intelligence and power. Ancient Persia was not a primitive society. It was one of the greatest empires the world had ever seen, known for advanced engineering, organized government, impressive architecture, and vast military strength. Yet within that same civilization existed stories of punishments so horrifying they still shock people thousands of years later. This contradiction appears throughout human history. Societies capable of incredible beauty and innovation have also created methods of torture beyond imagination. The Roman Empire built roads, aqueducts, and legal systems while crucifying thousands. Medieval kingdoms created magnificent cathedrals while publicly burning people alive. Human progress has never erased brutality completely. In fact, power often creates new ways to control through fear. Scaphism represents the extreme end of that mentality. The punishment was not about justice alone. It was about domination. By turning a human body into a spectacle of decay, rulers demonstrated absolute control over life and death. The victim lost not only freedom but dignity itself. That psychological destruction mattered deeply in ancient societies where honor and reputation were central to identity. Public suffering sent a message stronger than words ever could. Fear kept empires stable. But stories like Scaphism also force modern audiences to reflect on how easily humans can normalize cruelty when authority justifies it. Executioners carrying out such punishments may have viewed themselves simply as servants of the law. Crowds witnessing the suffering may eventually have become desensitized. History repeatedly shows that ordinary people can accept horrifying acts when culture, politics, or fear make them seem necessary. That realization is deeply uncomfortable because it suggests cruelty is not limited to monsters alone. It can emerge from systems, governments, and societies under the right conditions. Scaphism survives as more than just a gruesome historical story. It becomes a warning about what happens when human beings stop seeing others as human. Once a person is labeled a traitor, enemy, or criminal beyond redemption, unimaginable suffering can suddenly become acceptable in the eyes of power. That lesson remains relevant even today. While modern societies reject ancient torture methods publicly, history reminds us that fear and dehumanization remain dangerous forces in every era. Scaphism horrifies us not only because of the insects and agony, but because it proves how creative cruelty can become when empathy disappears completely. Today, Scaphism remains one of history's most infamous and disturbing execution methods because it combines every human fear into a single nightmare. It is the fear of being trapped, unable to move while danger slowly approaches. It is the fear of insects crawling across the skin and invading the body. It is the fear of infection, decay, humiliation, and prolonged suffering. But above all, it is the fear of losing control completely while death arrives inch by inch instead of all at once. Modern audiences are especially disturbed by Scaphism because it feels horrifyingly intimate. Many ancient punishments were violent but quick. Scaphism forced victims to participate in their own destruction over days or weeks. Their bodies became prisons. Their minds became battlegrounds. The punishment transformed nature itself into a weapon, using heat, insects, disease, and time to slowly erase a person's humanity. Whether every ancient description is fully accurate or partly exaggerated, the legend survives because it captures something unforgettable about human cruelty. Stories like this spread through generations because they shock us into confronting uncomfortable truths about history. Civilization has always contained both greatness and darkness. The same species capable of creating art, music, philosophy, and scientific discovery